Hello and welcome. I'm Al Barrows, and this is UFO Disclosure, the podcast that's meant to show an average person's reaction to all the UFO, UAP news from everywhere and anywhere. Today, I'll be discussing a very puzzling and controversial figure in the history of ufology. This person's name is Albert K. Bender. He formed a highly successful international group called the International Flying Saucer Bureau, or IFSB. It was a civilian group, much like MUFON today, which investigated what was known in those days as the UFO mystery. Suddenly, only after 1 year, in 1953, Bender closed the bureau. He said that three mysterious men in black had visited him and frightened him into taking this action. Then he also refused to tell anyone what he had learned about non-human intelligences, and he also did not tell anyone or give a reason for ending or closing IFSB. It wasn't until 10 years later, in 1962, that Bender wrote his tell-all book, The Flying Saucers and the Three Men. Within that book is contained the mystery of UFOs. Stay tuned. It's going to be an incredible podcast. This is a copy of Albert K. Bender's book, Flying Saucers and the Three Men, which he wrote 10 years after he closed the International Flying Saucer Bureau. So I read Albert K. Bender's book, Flying Saucers and the Three Men, and by chapter 9, I was getting a little bit bored, and by then I was thinking, so far, the account that I'm reading in this book were given by Albert Bender up to that chapter 9, and what was going on in the early 1950s was very reminiscent to today, by the way. The IFSBs was very much like MUFON. They did investigations. They had very reputable people, doctors, lawyers associated with them. So it depressed me a little bit to find that out, that they were pretty much going through or doing the same as we do today. Only difference might be the supposed quote unquote government transparency and disclosure, which amounts to very little progress in over 70 years. I mean, if you want to call what we're having now transparency and disclosure. Chapter 9 actually opens up with Bender telling how his organization, or the IFSB, by then, it was an international group. In a very short span of time, it became an international organization. In chapter 9, it starts out with him doing something very similar to what, say, Dr. Greer's group does today. They were trying to telepathically contact non-human intelligence. He makes contact, but he's warned to stop his UFO activities by the NHIs. Albert has an out-of-body experience. So Albert is visited by three floating shadowy figures, and that's Albert K. Bender there, posing with a sketch that he made of one of the shadowy men that visited him. And these three shadowy figures reveal they want to give Albert information, and they leave him a small piece of metal, which he is told to keep secret. This piece of metal was a means to contact the non-human intelligences. Albert is astrally taken aboard a craft, and by that I mean his astral form or his spirit form, not physically, but he was astrally taken on board a craft. The non-human intelligences reveal that they are here to extract a chemical from our oceans vital to their existence. And the NHIs inform Albert they have stations all over the world, and the NHI non-human intelligences inform Albert that they have non-human intelligences stationed within the Pentagon itself. Remember, this was back in 1952. I don't think conspiracy theories about aliens in the Pentagon started until after that. The NHIs change appearances from man to monster, so they can change their appearances. And On the non-human intelligence's planet, they have three sexes, Albert is told: male, female, and the third sex is asexual. And those asexual NHIs become their leaders. Albert wants to know why he was chosen, and the NHIs tell him that because of his curiosity and persistence to contact them and his honesty, that they decided to make contact, which later I would think that Albert regretted. I don't know why the NHIs would have contacted him if it was so vital that they kept their existence secret. So there was a bit of a contradiction there. I was troubled by that. Why they actually contacted Albert, why would they tell him their secret, why they were here, that they even existed, if then afterward they hounded him about keeping the secret for over 10 years. So the non-human intelligences reveal that they are here to extract a certain chemical from our ocean that's vital to their existence. And they inform Albert that they have non-human intelligent agents stationed within the Pentagon itself. And they do this by changing their appearance. Albert says that they're able to change from a very grotesque looking monster like natural appearance to very human like. Within their planet itself, Albert says he was informed that they have three sexes, not just two. They have a male, a female, and the third sex is asexual. And this asexual non-human intelligence becomes their leader. Albert decides to fabricate a story for his group, the IFSB, and doesn't tell them the truth. He claims to already know the secret of the UFOs, and Albert begins to close the IFSB. So everybody is wondering what's going on and what happened that all of a sudden he's closing the IFSB. So in 87, and I'm quoting from the book, he says, when they come into his room, a chill came over me as these figures occupied the very room in which I had experienced the almost unbelievable transport of my body from one spot to another. So he's talking about being astrally projected onto their base. What could they want by actually appearing in this manner and taking a chance of being seen by some other person? Exactly. He goes on to say, I backed away from them toward my bed. One came forward while the others stood in the background. And they didn't actually so much stand. He describes them as floating above the ground. One came forward while the others stood in the background, looking about the room. This was my first opportunity to see them at such close range. He describes them now. He says, their clothing was made of a black material, which reminded me of cloth used in the attire of clergymen. It was well pressed, appeared almost new. All the other apparel, such as ties, shirt, stockings, and shoes, was also black. They wore hats, Homburg style, also black, and that's sort of like a takeoff on the Stetson, that Homburg style. Their faces were unpleasant to look at. Their eyes shone like flashlight bulbs, and the teeth were pearly white, set in a very dark complexion. I could not see their hands, covered by black gloves. A bluish radiance enveloped their entire bodies. That's right. Anytime he sees them, they had this blue aura around them. A blue radiance enveloped their entire bodies, and I wondered if this was giving off the sulfuric odor. He also describes a sulfuric odor every time they're around him. Again, I was frightened. I waited for some move on their part, for I didn't know if I was to be treated kindly or with aggression. The figure closest to me soon settled the matter, as he spoke to me in the usual manner without moving his lips. So they speak to him telepathically. Later on, Albert is brought to their base in Antarctica. And this is something that has been going around in this conspiratorial circles for some time now, about an alien base in Antarctica. And this is, remember, 1952. And Albert is saying that they brought him to their base in Antarctica underneath the ground. They describe to him there what their planet is like and how their space stations are inside craters of their planet. And I'm quoting from the book. They tell Albert, all our cities are constructed underground. We have crater-like openings on the surface through which we are able to elevate spacecraft stations for takeoffs. So it's sort of an elevator system where a platform comes up through the crater, and this platform is where their spacecraft takes off from, and they also land from there. The alien goes on to say, when these stations are not in use, they descend into the craters, and the landing fields serve as a cover for the openings, with only communication towers visible. And then after that, they go on to show Albert what they're doing with their seawater. And they have this system where they're distilling the water and extracting some sort of a chemical that they need for their planet that's vital to their existence. It's called the Caesarean. This is what the platform looked like. It came out of the crater and they would land and take off from there. That was Albert's drawing of the platform where they take off and land from, called the Caesarean. And he describes the NHIs as monsters. He says that they're ugly, but that they can change their appearance as the three dark figures do. But they still retain their distinctive light blue light bulb eyes. But I was bothered by Albert's description of the non-human intelligence's operation. There was a lot of talk about, didn't sound very high tech. He kept mentioning buttons and levers. Reminded me a lot of a Flash Gordon episode, or a 1950s version of what a space station or alien station would be like, with buttons and levers. Finally, the three dark figures take him to the base in Antarctica to meet the Exalted One. And the Exalted One is the asexual leader for these non-human intelligences. And the Exalted One tells Albert that he has been permitted to be a guest because of his efforts to establish friendly relations with the non-human intelligences. But again, I was bothered by that because later on, Albert is plagued by their constant spying on him and surveillance, and just to make sure that he doesn't let out their secret about why they're here. The Exalted One allows Albert to ask questions. So Albert wants to know how long they've been here, and the Exalted One tells him that they've been here since 1945. Their main purpose is extracting a chemical out of our water. And for what purpose, the Exalted One couldn't tell Albert. They told Albert that they would be staying here for 15 years. And when Albert wants to know whether they intend to harm humans, the Exalted One says that only if necessary, even though every so often it becomes necessary to frighten, and sometimes worse. So I guess that means that they're not beyond killing a human. What bothered me also is that the Exalted One tells Albert that they've taken, quote, many to exhibit on their own planet, and most don't survive. So apparently they've abducted human beings to display, I guess, like in a zoo on their own planet. They tell Albert that they don't intend to take Albert to their planet unless he becomes, quote unquote, an obstacle. And again, Albert wants to know why he was chosen. And he's told that because he can keep a secret. And that again bothered me because later on, they're very worried about him letting out their secret. Albert also wants to know how big is space. And the Exalted One tells them that there's no end as far as they can tell. Albert asks about other life forms in our solar system. And he's told that Venus is still developing as a planet. He's told that Mars was populated, but that civilization was destroyed. The Exalted One implies that God doesn't exist, that human beings created the concept. The non-human intelligences that Albert encounters believe in a, quote, great central body that created everything. It's in the center of the universe and casts out everything from it, all its creations, including the planets. He's told that they do not believe in an afterlife and that they live 5 times longer than we do. They have no disease on their planet, but are plagued with a great blackness. And that great blackness is a void around their known universe. It's apparently a black void around their universe where many people had gone to and never returned. The Exalted One also tells Albert that under the earth there are cavernous cities of inhabitants that make themselves invisible in order to scare and steal from us. And I guess the Exalted One said that we think that these beings are ghosts. So I've heard of crypto extraterrestrials, or the idea that aliens might be underneath the ground. So this is back in 1952, and the NHI leader, or the Exalted One, is telling Albert that there is another civilization that is ghost-like, that lives in cavernous cities within our own planet, underneath us. And the whole base where he meets the Exalted One in Antarctica seems almost made up to me. There's a lot of description by Albert of the Exalted One pressing buttons and pulling levers. It almost all seems Wizard of Oz-like to me. So I read this with a pinch of salt, thinking that Albert might have taken some poetic license, even though he might have been contacted by NHIs. The whole idea of NHIs pressing buttons and pulling levers kind of made me skeptical. The Exalted One also shows Albert a panel, sort of a movie screen panel, where he shows him scenes from the NHI's planet. And he's told that on their planet, they control their population. They actually don't give birth like we do, but they hatch in eggs. And these eggs are kept from hatching until they actually need more people. So they control their population through their eggs. The NHIs give birth to eggs, and those eggs are kept in incubation until the population merits an increase in the population. And that's how they control their population. They do have weapons. He shows Albert that they have these incredible weapons. And the NHIs don't seem to eat food. What they eat is mainly fungus. It's a fungus-like food. The Exalted One insists on Albert keeping their secret. Finally, before Albert leaves, he requests that the Exalted One give him proof that he's not dreaming or that he's not a figment of his imagination. So the Exalted One agrees, and he tells him that the next day he'll see proof of that. Albert is given a small round metal disc, and it seems to be part of a communication system that they have so that he can keep in contact with the NHIs. Throughout this whole thing, by the way, Albert thinks that he might be going crazy, that he's imagining the whole thing. After that, Albert publishes this big article in his magazine because the International Flying Saucer Bureau has their own magazine or newsletter. And much like today, they published that their investigation of the UFO mystery, as they called it in those days, is approaching its final stages, which I thought was very similar to many reports today that we get about disclosure, that we're going to get a final disclosure, just much like Albert was thinking back then. And I can't help but see the comparison between what they were doing and what we're going through now. It's almost cyclical. Albert is also told that at any moment, the NHIs could activate all our atomic stockpile on Earth with just a push of a button, which is kind of scary. That would mean the total destruction of the Earth. Albert is threatened and warned against revealing his metal disc and any information about the NHI's mission to any friends or members of the IFSB or any family members, which reminded me a lot about today's disinformation campaign. And the United States Air Force became interested, just as it's interested in UAPs today. So after that, the NHIs are constantly spying on Albert. Every so often, they appear in his room. And one has to wonder, what did the NHIs fear had Albert given away their secret if they were so powerful? I also thought that it was interesting that back then the UFO groups had rivalries just like they do today. They had different theories and different ideas as to what's going on and who the NHIs actually are. So as quickly as Albert's IFSB, or International Flying Saucer Bureau, became big and spread internationally, just as fast as it became big, it also closed down just as fast. It closed down in the autumn of 1953, after just 1 year. And Albert puts out a statement, quote, "The mystery of the saucers has been solved and the source is already known." This is a statement that has yet to be said today. He believed back then, and still to the end of his life, thought that he knew the mystery of the UFO phenomenon. His story was actually printed in the local paper about the three dark men who visited him. After that, the three dark men control Albert with their light bulb eyes and their telepathic ability. There's another incident on page 128 of the book where Albert is actually massaged by three beautiful non-human intelligent women back at the Antarctic base. Then another hooded figure stands by as a light treatment is given to Albert, which the hooded figure says will ensure his continued good health. The Exalted One shows up after the light treatment that he gets and explains that the light that he was exposed to created an impulse that would stay on his body and would allow the non-human intelligences to track him. So as opposed to today, where we hear about implants, Albert was talking about some sort of an impulse, a light impulse that manifested onto his body, whereby they can track him. The Exalted One explains to Albert that the impulse light is meant to track him, also to make sure that he keeps their secret, and it's also in case he reveals their secret. And I quote, "They need only press a button and his body would be destroyed." So they're not exactly, warm and friendly NHIs. And you got, again, throughout the whole book, I was wondering, why did the not human intelligent beings reveal their secret mission to Albert if it was so important to keep it secret? Well, the Exalted One tells Albert that they will leave after their mission is completed and they will remove the impulse from his body. But that if he ever wants to contact them, he only needs to rub the metal disc that they gave him. And this part also sounds a little fabricated, almost like a genie's lamp, if you will. That's what the metal disc looked like. That's Albert's sketch. Albert is also told that once they leave, that the metal disc would disappear. And only then would he have permission to tell everybody what he knows. He's also told by the Exalted One that if he writes about his NHI experiences after they're gone, that he won't be believed except by a select few, which is true. You know, he wasn't believed back then, and his book wasn't taken very seriously. The Exalted One also says that there may be other visitors whose intent may not be the same as ours has been, but they may not come within many generations. If they do come, there will likely be very little you can do about their presence anyhow, which seems to be the case now. I mean, if what we're seeing now with these UAP reports, we don't seem to have very much control over what they do or their comings and goings. Albert's NHIs are indifferent. They're an indifferent type of extraterrestrial. They're very indifferent to humanity. They're not here to help us, just to use our resources, extract something out of our oceans. They seem to be indifferent to causing pain or even death. They're constantly threatening Albert with pain or even quote unquote worse consequences. If Albert doesn't keep their secret, he is threatened with quote headaches almost unbearable to him, and at such times he's to beware of more serious conditions. So Albert had to live a long time, at least 10 years, with their secret, with the fear of actual death. So in 1954, Albert gets married, and he wrote in the book, "Not once during my marriage did I receive another visitation, though often I went to the hiding place," which is where he kept his metal disc for communicating with the NHIs. He would go there to that hiding place, hoping the small metal disc would be gone. But every time, its strange glowing luminescence met my view. And this is Albert K. Bender later on in life with his wife. He lived to about 94 years of age. He died just recently in 2016. His wife, Betty, wanted to know why he closed the IFSB. Albert wouldn't tell her because he knew that it would mean his death and would surely mean his death and even worse for Betty. So he makes up some lies, even though Betty is still doubtful, but he never tells her for fear of both their lives. In 1956, Gray Barker, the publisher of his book, Flying Saucers and the Three Men, publishes his own book called They Know Too Much About Flying Saucers. And Albert becomes famous, so he pretty much outs Albert K. Bender and his story. And he becomes so famous that people want to talk to him. They want to know what he knows about the NHIs. They want him to reveal his secret. And Albert is threatened and haunted by people and groups wanting to know his secret constantly. And on his publisher's insistence, he actually starts to write at one point. He gets to about 4 pages, but then he gets that sulfuric odor that he usually got when the NHIs would come to visit him. And he started to get the usual headaches. And then he gets a phone call, and some mysterious voice tells him to stop writing. And when he goes back to his desk, all 4 pages have vanished. And in 1960, he's still having pains, and he hopes that his head and his eye pain will cease once the metal disc disappears and the NHIs have gone. So late in 1960, the NHIs finally departure finally happened, and his metal disc finally disappears. It's gone. He goes to his strong box, and it's gone. And everything else that was in his strong box or his safe has been disintegrated, which is very odd. And there's a strong sulfuric smell inside the safe, so strong that he has to shut it immediately. Albert goes to a doctor to see about his constant headaches. He's still having the headaches even after the metal disc and supposedly the NHIs have departed. And the doctors do an X-ray and they can't find any implants in his head. So Albert believes that the headaches and his eye aches are a result of radiation exposure that was caused by the presence of the three dark NHIs that visited him constantly. Albert also makes a note in his book on page 148 that since the metal disc disappeared and his NHIs had left, UFO reports worldwide had decreased. Albert claims that the Great Saucer Flap of 1952 occurred during the time that his visitors were on the Earth, and that it ended right after they left. So towards the end, Albert starts philosophizing, and he thinks that another non-human intelligence will not visit for a long time. And he thinks that if they do come, that they'll have more of a military agenda for some reason. He also weirdly speculates that in the future, UFOs will be more undetectable due to, number one, Albert believes we will have our own UFO type crafts by then, which he may be right. I mean, Stephen Greer says that we have our own man-made UAPs. And the second reason why Albert believes that UFOs will be undetectable is because there will be so many satellites in orbit. And I'm thinking of Starlink at this point. There's so many hundreds of satellites that Starlink is putting up there that either way, we won't be able to distinguish them from the NHI crafts. So Albert thinks that we'll have trouble distinguishing any UAPs from satellites that we put into orbit. So it's interesting to note that Albert's NHIs, even though they were non-hostile, took no interest in helping mankind. Afterward, Albert K. Bender was asked why he didn't take pictures, as proof. And his answer to that was that he was warned against doing that. And besides that, any film in the presence of the NHIs was automatically ruined. Any camera that had film in it in his room when the three dark figures visited him would be ruined by the time he took it out. The Exalted One told Albert that our planet is still young and is going to have a lot more progress. He also told us that our planet is cursed because we have so many races. The NHIs that visited Albert K. Bender only have one race on their planet, even though they have three sexes. Remember, they had one asexual sex that became their leaders. He also thinks that because of the many races that we have, that we'll always have conflict, and that this conflict might eventually end in the destruction of our planet. So he continues to hypothesize, and he says towards the end of the book that he thinks that the NHIs used whatever chemical or element that they extracted from our oceans and converted into cubes. They converted into sort of like a Boolean cube. He thinks that that became a source of their power somehow. Remember, they were processing seawater, and that took place in the caverns or underneath Antarctica, where their base was located. Albert also mentions angel hair, which was a byproduct of their processing of our seawater. And I remember hearing about an incident in Portugal where they had angel hair falling from the sky. And when tested, this angel hair had some sort of organic component to it. And Albert speculates that besides the processing of seawater in Antarctica, that there must have been some sort of additional processing taking place in the sky because of that angel hair that came down. It was a waste product that they returned to the sea, but sometimes they were careless and it dropped over land, which probably is what happened in Portugal. And as opposed to Earth's population problem, the visitors controlled theirs by storing their eggs, which is how they gave birth, and controlling their reproduction system that way. The visitors did not believe in God, remember, but they knew and feared of a great central power that created the universe. They believed in a great dark void also that surrounded their universe, and from which many of their people had gone to and never returned. Albert K. Bender's visitors also didn't believe in an afterlife, which I thought was kind of sad. But I've also heard in conspiracy circles that Greys don't have a soul, which is why they're so interested in us. So that might be similar to Albert K. Bender's NHIs, who don't believe in an afterlife, don't have a soul. And towards the end of the book, Albert also believes that we'll have traveled to the moon, to Mars and Venus in his own lifetime, which is pretty much now. He didn't die until 2016. So he was very optimistic. I'm sure he was probably puzzled by the fact that we went to the moon and never went back, when in fact he expected us to have gone to Venus and Mars by now. Albert says that he was looking forward to that because it would confirm or debunk much of what the visitors told him. The visitors also told Albert that there are people living in vast caverns beneath the surface of the earth. Remember, they were ghost-like beings, which the visitors told him are often mistaken as ghosts. Albert says that the most interesting confirmation of his contacts was when he asked the visitors to show him a physical sign that they are real and not something in his dreams. And the very next day, a UAP showed up and shot a laser through a stop sign where he lived in New Haven, and that was documented in the local paper. So Albert K. Bender explains in his book that it was his way of finally giving answers to the thousands that wanted to know why he had closed IFSB, and that he wrote the book honestly and truthfully. Albert says in his book that he promised all his former members of the International Flying Saucer Bureau that he would give them the answer as to why he closed the IFSB. And finally, he ends the book by saying that he's bowing out and hopes he can now have a normal life and be left alone, and his involvement with other worldly visitors can be at last partly forgotten. This is a picture of Albert K. Bender when he was younger. This is an article that was written up about him in the local paper. Another article that was written about Albert K. Bender. And this is a sketch that he made of one of the dark men with the light bulb eyes that would float and had the blue aura around them that would visit him. And that's the Hamburg hat that I mentioned before that they wore. Albert K. Bender with his wife later on in years when he was in the Air Force. And this is Albert K. Bender right before he died. And final pages of his book, he wrote that he was bowing out now and hoped that he could now live a normal life and be left alone, and his involvement with other worldly visitors could at last be partially forgotten. So I thought it was really odd that he had so much success right away in 1952, formed an international organization that spread around the world, had a lot of professional people associated with it, much like MUFON. And just after 1 year, he just closed it down without giving anyone an answer as to why. And then after that, I mean, I thought, as with a lot of these ufologists or people that delve into ufology or do UFO research, I thought he had been assassinated or died mysteriously. No, he went on to live until he was 94 years old. He didn't die until recently, 2016. So either he totally lost interest in the subject matter or he made this whole thing up. You guys be the judge. But I thought it was pertinent enough to do a podcast on, because he claimed to have solved the mystery of the UFO phenomenon, something that we have yet to say today. And he claimed to the end of his days, to his deathbed, that his story was true. My name is Al Barrows. This has been UFO Disclosure. I hope you enjoyed that. Keep searching for the truth no matter what. My website is ufo-disclosure.com. My Instagram is UFO Disclosure Podcast. My Twitter is at UFO Disclosure with an underscore. And my YouTube is at UFO Disclosure dash B as in Bravo, R as in Romeo, 3YY. Let's keep the kids in the Gaza and the Ukraine area in our prayers. They need protection. Let's manifest good things for them. They're lonely and afraid. My good intentions and love go out to all. Thank you. Thank you for listening to my podcast.